The sound of tennis ball meeting racket creates a perfect thwack. The crowd falls silent enough to hear breathing. Donovan Pierce, CEO of Teknova Industries, stands on the tennis court with absolute focus. Scarlett Whitmore remembers her words from 3 months ago, "Beat me in tennis and I'll marry you." She had laughed mockingly, thinking this man only knew money and business deals, that women had never been his concern. Impossible. Someone whispers, Pierce has never touched a sport in his life. But the way he grips the racket, the way he moves as if tennis flows in his blood. Had she challenged the wrong person, or had her impulsiveness pushed a woman who was always in control to now feel vulnerability invading her entire mind? The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine courts of Westfield Elite Tennis Club. 3 months earlier, this same venue had witnessed one of the most shocking challenges in corporate America's recent memory. What started as a routine business meeting between 2 rival CEOs had escalated into something that would change both their lives forever. The Elite Tennis Club wasn't just any sports facility. It was where power brokers made deals over champagne and where Scarlett Whitmore had built her reputation as an unbeatable champion both on and off the court. Donovan Pierce had arrived that day with a simple objective: convince Scarlett to sell her biotech company to his tech empire. Teknova Industries had been quietly acquiring smaller firms, building a portfolio that would revolutionize healthcare technology. Whitmore Biotech was the missing piece, the crown jewel that would complete his vision. But Scarlett wasn't just any CEO, she was Theodore Whitmore's daughter, heir to a pharmaceutical dynasty that had ruled the industry for 3 generations. The tension in the club's private dining room had been palpable. Scarlett, fresh from her morning tennis practice, still wore her pristine white athletic attire. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail, not a strand out of place despite the intensity of her workout. Across from her sat Donovan, impeccably dressed in his signature navy suit, his steel-grey eyes studying every document with the precision of a surgeon. The contrast between them was striking. She radiated athletic confidence while he embodied corporate authority. "Mr. Pierce," Scarlett had said, setting down her glass of sparkling water with deliberate force. "I've told you repeatedly that Whitmore Biotech isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone." Her voice carried the same commanding tone that had intimidated boardrooms across the country. She had built her reputation on being untouchable, uncompromising, and utterly in control of every situation. Donovan leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Miss Whitmore, I understand your attachment to the family business. But consider the possibilities if we combined our resources. Your breakthrough in cancer research could reach millions more patients with Teknova's distribution network." His voice was measured, professional, but there was something else there, a hint of desperation that only someone who had lost everything once before could understand. Scarlett's laugh was sharp, cutting through the polished atmosphere of the club. "You think this is about money? About reaching more patients?" She stood up abruptly, her athletic frame casting a shadow across the mahogany table. "This is about legacy, Mr. Pierce. Something I don't expect a man who's built his empire on acquisition and hostile takeovers to understand." The words stung more than Donovan cared to admit. He had heard similar accusations before, that he was nothing more than a corporate raider, buying success rather than building it. What people didn't know was that every acquisition was personal for him, a way to prove that he could create something lasting after losing everything he had once held dear. His ex-wife's betrayal had taught him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but success was something he could control. You know nothing about my motivations. Donovan replied quietly, his composure never wavering despite the fire in his eyes. But I know about yours. Your father's been pressuring you to marry for business advantage. How's that working out for your precious legacy? The comment hit its mark. Scarlett's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment, revealing the pressure she faced from every direction. Theodore Whitmore had made it clear that the family empire needed strategic alliances, and marriage was the most reliable way to secure them. It was an old-fashioned approach that made Scarlett's skin crawl, but she couldn't deny its effectiveness in preserving family dynasties. My personal life is none of your concern, she said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The truth was that she felt trapped between her father's expectations and her own desires for independence. Every eligible bachelor who approached her seemed more interested in her company's stock price than in her as a person. Donovan sensed the shift in her demeanor and pressed his advantage. Perhaps we could find a mutually beneficial arrangement. A merger that satisfies both our needs without the complications of hostile acquisition. He pulled out a revised contract, sliding it across the table. Equal partnership, shared control, combined resources. Scarlett glanced at the papers, but didn't pick them up. Instead, she moved towards the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the tennis courts below. Several matches were in progress, the rhythmic sound of balls being struck creating a steady percussion that seemed to calm her racing thoughts. Tennis had always been her sanctuary, the one place where she felt completely in control of her destiny. You want to know what I think about your offer, Mr. Pierce? She said without turning around. I think you're a man who believes everything has a price. That success can be bought rather than earned. That relationships are just another form of transaction. She finally faced him, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like pity. Beat me in tennis and I'll marry you, she declared suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. The challenge hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down in a medieval court. But when you lose, and you will lose, you'll stop harassing me about this merger and find some other company to add to your collection. The silence that followed was deafening. Donovan stared at her as if she had just proposed something completely insane, which perhaps she had. Scarlett herself seemed surprised by her own words, but she wasn't about to back down. She had never lost a tennis match at this club, never met an opponent who could match her speed, strategy, or sheer determination. It seemed like the perfect way to end this conversation once and for all. You're serious, Donovan said finally, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. You want to settle a multi-billion-dollar business decision with a tennis match? Dead serious, Scarlett replied, crossing her arms over her chest. Unless you're too intimidated to face me on a level playing field. I understand if corporate raiders prefer boardrooms to actual competition. The insult was carefully calculated, designed to provoke exactly the reaction she wanted. Donovan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment something dangerous flickered in his eyes. He had spent years building his reputation on never backing down from a challenge, never showing weakness in front of competitors. But this was different. This was personal in a way that business negotiations never were. What makes you think I even know how to play tennis? He asked, though there was something in his tone that suggested the question wasn't entirely genuine. Scarlett's smile was triumphant, predatory. Exactly my point. You'll spend your money on the best equipment, hire the most expensive coach, maybe even bribe the referee. But you can't buy the instincts, the muscle memory, the thousands of hours of practice that real champions possess. Some things can't be purchased, Mr. Pierce. Little did she know that hidden in Donovan's home office, buried beneath financial reports and acquisition plans, was a small wooden box containing his most treasured possessions. Inside that box were newspaper clippings from his high school years, when he had been known throughout the state as one of the most promising young tennis players of his generation. A full scholarship to Stanford had been within his grasp before family responsibilities forced him to choose a different path. Interesting proposition, Donovan said slowly, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with business projections. But if I win, the terms are different. Not just marriage, a real partnership, in business and in life. No more games, no more hiding behind family legacy or corporate pride. Scarlett felt a chill run down her spine, though she couldn't quite explain why. There was something in his eyes now, a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his usual corporate bravado. For just a moment, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But her pride wouldn't let her back down now, not in front of the small crowd that had gathered to watch their heated exchange. "Fine," she said, extending her hand for a shake that felt more like sealing a pact with the devil. "1 week from today, right here at Westfield. Yeah. Winner takes all." As their hands touched, Scarlett felt an electric shock that had nothing to do with static electricity. Donovan's grip was firm, calloused in a way that surprised her. His hands didn't feel like those of a man who spent all his time behind a desk, pushing papers. They felt like the hands of someone who had worked, who had struggled, who had built something with more than just money and influence 1 week. Donovan agreed, releasing her hand slowly. "I hope you're prepared to honor your commitment, Miss Whitmore. Because I always keep my promises." The next 7 days passed in a blur of preparation and speculation. Word of the challenge had spread through the business community like wildfire, with betting pools forming in corporate offices across the city. Some called it the most ridiculous business decision in history. Others saw it as a brilliant publicity stunt. But those who knew Scarlett Whitmore understood that she never made idle threats or empty gestures. Scarlett threw herself into training with an intensity that surprised even her regular coach. Her serves became more powerful, her returns more precise, her strategy more ruthless. She had always been competitive, but this felt different, personal in a way that transcended mere athletic achievement. The idea that Donovan Pierce might actually defeat her seemed not just impossible, but insulting to everything she had worked to build. Meanwhile, Donovan seemed to disappear from public view entirely. His assistant fielded calls with vague explanations about him being in preparation mode. Business associates who tried to reach him were told he was unavailable for the rest of the week. Some assumed he was desperately trying to learn the basics of tennis. Others wondered if he would simply fail to show up, claiming some kind of business emergency as an excuse. What none of them knew was that Donovan was spending his days at a private court an hour outside the city, working with Coach Martinez, the same man who had trained him during his high school championship years. The muscle memory came back slowly at first, then with increasing fluency as his body remembered movements it hadn't performed in over 20 years. "You still have it," Martinez said on the 4th day, watching Donovan execute a perfect cross-court backhand. The power, the precision, the instinct. "Why did you stop playing?" Donovan paused between serves, his chest rising and falling with controlled breathing. "Life got complicated. Family needed me to focus on other things. Business became more important than games. And now? Martinez asked, tossing him another ball. Now it's not a game anymore, Donovan replied, his next serve landing exactly where he intended. Now it's about proving that some things are worth fighting for. Ruby Pierce, Donovan's 8-year-old daughter, watched from the sidelines with the wisdom that sometimes comes to children who have learned too early that life is unpredictable. She had never seen her father play tennis before, but she recognized the focused intensity he brought to everything he truly cared about. It was the same expression he wore when helping her with difficult homework, or when talking about building something that would make the world better. "Daddy," she said during a water break, "why is this tennis match so important?" Donovan knelt down to her level, his eyes soft in a way they only were when he looked at his daughter. "Sometimes, Ruby, we have to do difficult things to protect what matters most. This match isn't really about tennis. It's about proving that some people are worth fighting for, even when they don't believe it themselves." "Is Miss Whitmore worth fighting for?" Ruby asked with the directness that only children possess. The question caught Donovan off guard. He had been thinking about the match in terms of business strategy, of corporate competition, of proving a point about judgment and assumptions. But Ruby's question forced him to confront something he had been trying to ignore. Somewhere in the past week, this had stopped being about Whitmore Biotech and started being about Scarlett herself. "I think she might be," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "But she doesn't think she is. And sometimes the hardest person to convince is ourselves." The morning of the match dawned clear and bright, with just enough breeze to make the conditions challenging but fair. The elite tennis club had never seen anything like the crowd that gathered that day. Business executives rubbed shoulders with sports journalists. Social media influencers positioned themselves for the best camera angles. Even Theodore Whitmore had flown in from his estate in the Hamptons, though whether to support his daughter or protect his business interests remained unclear. Scarlett arrived an hour early, using the time to warm up and center herself. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing through every possible scenario. In her rational moments, she knew this was insane, risking her entire future on a tennis match. But something deeper than rationality was driving her now, something that felt like destiny or disaster. She couldn't tell which. Donovan appeared 15 minutes before the scheduled start time, moving through the crowd with the calm confidence of a man who had already accepted whatever outcome awaited him. He was dressed in simple white tennis attire that looked both new and somehow familiar on his athletic frame. His dark hair was slightly longer than his usual corporate style, giving him an almost dangerous appeal that several spectators noticed and commented on. The two competitors met at center court for the traditional handshake and coin toss. Up close, Scarlett could see details she had missed during their previous encounters, the faint lines around Donovan's eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions, the way his hands moved with practiced grace, the subtle confidence in his posture that suggested this might not be as one-sided as she had expected. "Last chance to back out," she offered, though her voice lacked its usual mockery. Something about the intensity in his eyes made joking feel inappropriate. "I never back out of a promise," Donovan replied, his serve selection winning the coin toss. "Especially not when the stakes are this high." The first serve came without fanfare, without dramatic pause or theatrical flourish. Donovan simply tossed the ball, brought his racket back, and delivered a shot that made the crowd collectively gasp. The ball crossed the net with precision and power that belonged in professional tournaments, not amateur challenges. Scarlett, caught completely off guard, could only watch as it landed exactly on the service line, a perfect ace that left her standing motionless. The silence that followed was profound and pregnant with implications. Every assumption, every expectation, every confident prediction was suddenly thrown into question by that single, devastating serve. Scarlett felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she realized that everything she thought she knew about Donovan Pierce might be wrong. "Game point," the line judge called, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. Scarlett's mind raced as she moved to receive the second serve. How was this possible? She had done her research, had her people investigate everything about Donovan's background. There had been no mention of tennis, no indication that he possessed any athletic ability whatsoever. Yet the serve she had just witnessed belonged to someone with years of serious training and competition experience. The second serve was equally devastating, though this time Scarlett managed to get her racket on the ball. Her return was weak, desperate, the shot of someone who had been caught completely unprepared. Donovan moved to the net with fluid grace, putting away the volley with casual efficiency that spoke of muscle memory developed over countless hours of practice. 15, love, the judge announced, though his voice seemed to come from very far away. Scarlett called timeout, moving to the sideline where her water bottle and towel waited. Her hands were shaking slightly, though whether from adrenaline or something closer to fear, she couldn't tell. Around the court, she could hear the murmur of confused voices as spectators tried to process what they were witnessing. How is this possible? Vivian Blackwood, her closest friend and business advisor, whispered urgently. "I thought you said he'd never played sports." "That's what I thought," Scarlett replied, her voice barely audible. "That's what everyone thought." She looked across the court at Donovan, who was stretching calmly as if this were just another day at the office. There was something different about him now, something that went beyond mere athletic ability. He moved with the confidence of a man who had found his element, who had stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. For the first time since she had known him, Donovan Pierce looked completely, authentically himself. The timeout ended, and Scarlett returned to the baseline with grim determination. She had built her reputation on never giving up, never letting circumstances dictate her fate. If Donovan wanted a real match, she would give him one. But as she prepared to receive his third serve, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to discover just how little she actually knew about the man standing across from her. Donovan's third serve was different, not quite as powerful as the first two, but placed with surgical precision to her backhand. This time Scarlett was ready, returning the ball with authority down the line. Donovan moved to intercept, his footwork smooth and practiced, sending back a cross-court shot that forced her to sprint to the opposite corner. The rally that followed was unlike anything the crowd had expected to see. Shot after shot was exchanged with increasing intensity, each player pushing the other to greater heights of performance. Scarlett's conditioning and recent training served her well, but Donovan matched her stroke for stroke, with a style that seemed to come from deep memory rather than recent practice. After nearly 30 shots, Scarlett finally found an opening, sending a drop shot just over the net that seemed impossible to reach. But Donovan anticipated it perfectly, sprinting forward and delivering a passing shot down the line that left her completely wrong-footed. The crowd erupted in appreciation for what had been genuinely spectacular tennis, regardless of the unusual circumstances. 30, love, the judge called, and Scarlett felt the first real flutter of panic in her chest. As the match continued, the impossible became undeniable. Donovan wasn't just competent, he was exceptional. His serves consistently hit speeds that would have been impressive on the professional tour. His court coverage was outstanding, his shot selection intelligent and strategic. Most unsettling of all, he seemed to be holding back, playing within himself rather than giving his maximum effort. By the time Donovan had won the first set 6-0, the crowd had moved beyond surprise into something approaching awe. This wasn't the corporate executive they thought they knew. This was an athlete of genuine quality, someone who belonged on tennis courts rather than in boardrooms. The transformation was so complete that some spectators wondered if they were witnessing an elaborate case of mistaken identity. During the break between sets, Theodore Whitmore approached his daughter with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. "Scarlett, what is happening out there? Who is this man?" "I don't know, Dad," she admitted, her voice hollow with the realization that she might have made the biggest mistake of her life. "I thought I knew, but apparently I was wrong about everything." Theodore's face was grim as he processed the implications. "If you lose this match, if you actually marry him, what happens to our agreement with the Morrison Group? What happens to the merger we've been negotiating for 6 months? The mention of the Morrison Group sent another chill through Scarlett's system. Richard Morrison had been her father's choice for her eventual husband, a safe, predictable alliance between 2 pharmaceutical dynasties. The thought of explaining to him that she had gambled away their engagement on a tennis match made her feel physically ill. "One set at a time," she said, trying to summon some of her earlier confidence. "This isn't over yet." But as the second set began, it became clear that Donovan had been warming up during the first. His shots became more aggressive, his movement more fluid, his strategy more sophisticated. He wasn't just beating her, he was outclassing her in every aspect of the game. The woman who had never lost a match at this club was being systematically dismantled by someone she had dismissed as a corporate amateur. The transformation in Donovan was remarkable to witness. Gone was the controlled, measured businessman who calculated every word and gesture. In his place was someone more primal, more authentic, someone who moved with the unconscious grace of a natural athlete operating at the peak of his abilities. His face showed a kind of joy that none of his business associates had ever seen, the pure pleasure of doing something he was born to do. "Where did this come from?" Scarlett called across the court during a changeover, her voice carrying genuine curiosity alongside her growing desperation. "High school," Donovan replied simply, toweling off sweat that spoke of genuine exertion despite his dominance. "State champion, class of 2005. Full scholarship to Stanford before family obligations changed my priorities." The admission hit Scarlett like a physical blow. State champion, full scholarship to Stanford. This wasn't some middle-aged businessman trying to recapture his youth. This was a serious athlete who had chosen a different path. She realized with growing horror that she had challenged one of the best players in the state's history, someone who had given up tennis at the height of his abilities rather than abandoning his responsibilities. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Would it have mattered? Donovan's response was quiet but pointed. "You had already decided who I was and what I was capable of. Just like everyone else in my life has done for the past 20 years. The words carried a weight of accumulated disappointment that made Scarlett suddenly see their entire relationship in a different light. She had dismissed him as nothing more than a corporate raider, someone who bought success rather than earning it. But what if she had been wrong? What if the man standing across from her had sacrificed his own dreams to build something meaningful, something that would provide for the people who depended on him? The second set ended with the same devastating efficiency as the first. 6-0. Scarlett had managed to win only a handful of points across both sets, her usual strategy and technique rendered useless against an opponent who seemed to anticipate her every move. The crowd, initially excited by the prospect of an upset, had grown quiet as they witnessed what was essentially a tennis masterclass disguised as a corporate publicity stunt. As they sat during the break before the final set, Scarlett found herself studying Donovan with new eyes. The calloused hands she had noticed during their handshake suddenly made sense. They were the hands of someone who had spent countless hours gripping a tennis racket, not just shuffling papers and typing emails. The confident way he moved, the precise way he spoke, even the intensity in his eyes all took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of someone who had been forced to hide his true nature for decades. "I need to ask you something," she said, surprising herself with the vulnerability in her voice. "If you win this match, if I actually have to marry you, what happens then? Is this just about acquiring my company, or is there something more?" Donovan considered the question carefully, his expression softening slightly. 3 months ago, this was about business, about proving that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can create something extraordinary. But somewhere in the past week, it became about something else entirely. "What?" Scarlett asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. "It became about proving that people can change, can grow, can become more than what others expect them to be. Your father wants you to marry for business advantage. My ex-wife thought I was nothing more than a paycheck and a convenience. But maybe, just maybe, 2 people who have been underestimated their entire lives could find something real together." The honesty in his voice was more devastating than any tennis shot he had delivered. Scarlett felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes as she realized that her impulsive challenge had revealed something she hadn't been prepared to confront, the possibility that her judgments about Donovan Pierce had been as wrong as everyone else's judgments about her. The final set began with a serve that seemed to carry the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Donovan's ball crossed the net with the same precision and power that had characterized the entire match. But this time, Scarlett was ready. Not ready to win. She understood now that victory was impossible, but ready to compete with the dignity and skill that had made her a champion in her own right. The rallies in the third set were longer, more complex, more beautiful to watch. Scarlett played with the desperation of someone fighting for her life, while Donovan demonstrated the patient efficiency of someone who had already achieved his objective. Yet there was something almost gentle in the way he constructed points, as if he understood that this was about more than winning and losing. When match point finally arrived, Donovan served with less power than he was capable of, giving Scarlett a chance to return the ball and extend the rally. For nearly a minute, they traded shots with increasing intensity, each trying to find the perfect combination of placement and power that would end the match. Finally, Scarlett's backhand sailed just wide of the sideline, and the match was over. "Game, set, and match to Pierce," the judge announced. 6-love, 6-love, 6-1. The crowd erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever, but Scarlett barely heard it. She stood at the baseline, racket hanging loose in her hand, trying to process what had just happened. In the space of 90 minutes, her entire world had been turned upside down. The man she had dismissed as a corporate interloper had not only defeated her completely, but had done so with a grace and skill that commanded genuine respect. Donovan approached the net slowly, his expression serious despite his overwhelming victory. When Scarlett finally moved to meet him there, their handshake lasted longer than protocol required. Up close, she could see the satisfaction in his eyes. but also something that looked like concern. "You played beautifully," he said quietly, his voice audible only to her despite the crowd pressing close around them, especially in that last set. "You never gave up." "Neither did you," she replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. 20 years ago, I mean, when you gave up tennis for your family. That takes a different kind of courage than anything that happens on a tennis court." Donovan's expression softened at her words, and for a moment the competitive intensity faded into something more human, more vulnerable. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know." The crowd began to press closer, journalists shouting questions and cameras flashing from every angle. The business implications of what had just occurred would reverberate through corporate America for months to come. But in that moment, standing at the net where their hands still touched, Scarlett and Donovan existed in a bubble of understanding that transcended the chaos around them. "So," Scarlett said with a weak smile, "I guess we need to plan a wedding." "Only if you want to," Donovan replied, his voice carrying a sincerity that cut through all the noise and spectacle. The match was about proving a point, about showing that assumptions can be dangerous. But what happens next, that's about choice. Your choice. The words hung between them as the crowd continued to surge around the court, everyone wanting to be part of what was already being called the most unusual corporate merger in history. But Scarlett barely noticed the cameras or the questions being shouted in her direction. She was looking into the eyes of a man who had just systematically dismantled every assumption she had held about him, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, she was ready to discover who she might become if she stopped trying to be who everyone else expected her to be. 3 weeks after the match, Donovan requested a private meeting with Scarlett at the same elite tennis club where everything had changed. The business world was buzzing with speculation about their upcoming merger negotiations, but Donovan had something entirely different on his mind. He had spent sleepless nights thinking about the woman who had challenged him to prove himself, and had come to a realization that went far deeper than any corporate strategy. When Scarlett arrived, she found him waiting in the same private dining room where their confrontation had begun. On the mahogany table between them lay a single document, the marriage contract that had been drawn up by their respective lawyers, complete with prenuptials, business arrangements, and all the legal protections 2 billionaire CEOs would need. The paper looked official, binding, and utterly without romance. "I've been thinking about what happened on that court," Donovan said as Scarlett took her seat across from him. His voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with business negotiations. "About what it really meant, and what I really want from this arrangement we've found ourselves in." Scarlett studied his face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way his hands rested carefully on the table, avoiding the contract between them. "Having second thoughts about claiming your prize?" she asked, though her tone held more curiosity than mockery. "Not second thoughts," Donovan replied carefully. "Clearer thoughts. When I won that match, I proved something to myself that I'd forgotten over the years, that some victories aren't worth having if they come at the wrong cost." He reached for the contract, lifting it slightly from the table. "This document represents everything that's wrong with how we've both been living our lives." The paper rustled softly in his hands as he continued. "You challenged me because you thought I was just another corporate raider who believed everything could be bought. And maybe you were right. Maybe I had become that person. But somewhere on that tennis court, I remembered who I used to be, before life taught me that emotions were liabilities and relationships were just another form of negotiation. Scarlett felt her breath catch as she watched him hold the contract. There was something in his expression that reminded her of the way he had looked when he was playing tennis, completely present, completely authentic, completely himself. "What are you saying, Donovan?" "I'm saying that I don't want a wife who's honoring a contract," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't want a business partnership disguised as a marriage. I don't want someone who chose me because they lost a bet." He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw vulnerability there that took her breath away. "I want someone who chooses me because they can't imagine choosing anyone else." Without breaking eye contact, Donovan took the marriage contract in both hands and tore it cleanly in half. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo in the quiet room like a declaration of independence. "I don't need a forced promise," he said as the pieces fluttered to the table. "I need you to choose me with your heart, not your honor." The gesture was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything Scarlett had believed about his character, that she felt tears spring to her eyes. In that moment, she understood that the man sitting across from her was nothing like the corporate automaton she had imagined. He was someone who valued authentic connection over guaranteed outcomes, someone who would rather risk losing everything than win something that wasn't freely given. "You're giving up your victory," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The merger, the partnership, everything you worked for." "I'm not giving up anything that matters," Donovan replied, gathering the torn pieces of the contract and setting them aside. "If you want to explore a partnership between our companies, we can do that as equals, as professionals who respect each other's abilities. If you want to explore something personal between us, we can do that as two people who choose to see where honesty and attraction might lead." He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked completely relaxed. "But whatever we choose, it will be because we both want it, not because of some ridiculous wager made in a moment of pride." Scarlett stared at the torn contract, then back at Donovan's face. Everything she thought she knew about power, about winning, about what it meant to be strong, was shifting like sand beneath her feet. She had built her entire identity around never backing down, never showing weakness, never letting anyone else have the upper hand. But here was a man who had achieved the ultimate victory, and was willingly giving it up for something he couldn't guarantee, couldn't control, couldn't buy. "You realize what you're doing, don't you?" she asked, though she was beginning to understand that he knew exactly what he was doing. "You're betting everything on the possibility that I might actually want to be with you. Without contracts, without guarantees, without any of the protections that people like us usually insist on." "Yes," Donovan said simply. "I'm betting on the possibility that beneath all our corporate armor and defensive strategies, we might actually like each other. I'm betting that the woman who had the courage to challenge a stranger to a tennis match might have the courage to explore something real with someone who sees her for who she actually is." The silence that followed was charged with possibility and risk in equal measure. Scarlett felt something shifting inside her chest, something that had been locked away behind years of careful calculation and strategic thinking. She was looking at a man who had just demonstrated more courage in 2 minutes than most people showed in a lifetime, and she was beginning to understand why her heart had been racing ever since that tennis match ended. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up from her chair and walked around the table to where Donovan sat. He looked up at her, with an expression of hope mixed with uncertainty, clearly unsure what her movement toward him meant. When she reached him, she paused for just a moment, studying his face as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Then, without another word, she leaned down and kissed him. It was not the polite, calculated kiss of a business arrangement or social obligation. It was the kiss of a woman who had just realized that the most important victories in life couldn't be won through strategy or strength, but only through the courage to be vulnerable with someone who had earned that vulnerability. When they finally broke apart, Donovan's eyes were bright with something that looked like amazement. "Does this mean you're choosing me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm choosing to find out who we could be together," Scarlett replied, her hand still resting on his shoulder. "Without contracts, without predetermined outcomes, without any guarantee except that we'll both be honest about what we want." She glanced at the torn pieces of paper on the table, then back at his face. "You were right. Some things can't be bought or negotiated or won in a contest. They can only be chosen, freely and completely, by two people who trust each other enough to take the risk." As they stood together in the room where their story had begun, both of them understood that they were embarking on something far more challenging and far more rewarding than any business merger or corporate acquisition. They were choosing to discover whether two people who had spent their lives protecting themselves from vulnerability could find the courage to build something real together. The torn marriage contract remained on the table between them, a reminder that the best partnerships in life, whether in business or in love, could never be forced or bought or won through clever maneuvering. They could only be chosen again and again by two people who valued authenticity over security and connection over control. And as Donovan and Scarlett left the elite tennis club together, they carried with them the understanding that their greatest victory wasn't the tennis match that had brought them together, but the decision to choose each other freely, completely, and without reservation.